Right, I think we'll begin. I want to welcome everyone to the Responsible Conduct of Research Workshop Series. Today's presenter is Dr. Stephen Fliesler. He will be presenting on an overview of responsible conduct of research. But first, I just want to go over a few things. We have other series running this spring in dissemination and implementation science and also translational teamwork. So I can send a schedule of our workshop series in the chat. We also have a whole library of resources and recordings on our CTSI Clinical and Translational Science Institute YouTube page. So I will paste a link in the chat for that as well for those who are interested. We will be offering a certificate of completion for this series. You have to attend all 6 sessions, and then we will automatically be sending those certificates to those who attend all of the sessions. If you are not able to attend every session but are still interested in a certificate, you can email me, Elizabeth Bengert. I'll paste my email in the chat. And if you're interested in a micro-credential in responsible research, reach out to Catherine Sedota, cmp9@buffalo.edu. I'll paste her email in the chat as well. So reach out to her if you are interested in that. For physicians, we will offer continuing medical education credits. Today's session, you can earn 1.5 credits, and for the whole series, you're eligible for up to 9 credits. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat, and at the end of the presentation, we can address those during the Q&A. And then I will also be placing the evaluation link in the chat at the end of the presentation. Please fill that out. So now I will turn it over to Dr. Fliesler, who will give an overview of today's session.
Thank you very much, Liz. And I want to thank Les Bengert, who's standing in to help facilitate this workshop with any of the technical details and managing the chat. So today is the first lecture in this series, and I'm trying to advance this now. There we go. So the first lecture is just an overview of responsible conduct of research. I will be giving the second lecture on authorships and reviewer ethics on February 25th. So we'll have a skip in the workshop. And then there are 4 other workshop lectures to follow on the 4th of March, the 25th, April 1st, and April 15th on these topics. I have no disclosure. So academic integrity policies have been in place for several years. We have a Office of Academic Integrity at the university, and it covers all of the 11 colleges and schools of the university. All persons that are engaged in any way in the research enterprise at this university are required to have exposure to this material. Here is the policy statement. And there's several different ways that you can get exposure to RCR training. This is just one. The CITI program, of course, on responsible conduct of research is also offered, and most principal investigators have to complete this training on a regular basis. I actually helped develop this course content almost 20 years ago is when we started it, before I even moved to the university. The Office of the Research Integrity is under the DHHS of the federal government. They have mandated that a responsible conduct of research training must occur at any institution that receives federal grant dollars for performing research. So we are in compliance by offering this training workshop. So let's talk about some foundational definitions. So responsible conduct of research really goes back to ethics. And ethics are a set of moral principles that govern a person's behavior or conducting or an activity such as research. It's also a branch of knowledge under philosophy that deals with moral principles. Now, academic integrity is not equivalent to ethics, but it is under the fundamental principles of ethics. And in this case, academic integrity is defined as commitment to core values. And the core values are honesty, trust, fairness, respect, and responsibility. And you can see these aspects of your engagement in any academic process are fundamental to being in the academic enterprise. So what is moral reasoning? Boiled down to this very simple diagram, moral reasoning is answering the question, is this right or wrong? Well, where do our fundamental concepts of what is right and wrong come from? Well, this is centuries old. So going back to Confucius, so 500 years before Common Era, Confucius was a very famous Chinese philosopher, and he came up with what became known as the Silver Rule, which is posed in the negative. Never impose on others what you would not choose for yourself. The Golden Rule then came several hundred years later, and a famous Jewish scholar, Hillel, came up with the fundamental premise of the Golden Rule: that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. So very similar, but just slightly word changes of the Silver Rule. And then probably most people are very familiar with the Golden Rule that was espoused by Jesus Christ. In Christianity and Islam, this Golden Rule is posed in the positive. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so all the major religions of the world have taken up this fundamental concept of moral reasoning. So here's the outline for tonight's lecture: historical perspective on the problem of responsible conduct of research, evolution of the definition of what is research misconduct, the fundamentals of research misconduct is centered on falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism, or FFP. There are UB policies on research misconduct that are in place and easily accessible on the web. I'm going to go through what I call my rogues gallery of famous cases of violations of research misconduct, the nature of prevalence and causes of research misconduct, and then how to deal with allegations of misconduct, and then consequences and protections. And at the end of the lecture, we will have 3 cases to discuss that illustrate the concepts that I hopefully will have conveyed over the next 60 minutes or so. And the objectives of this particular lecture is at the conclusions of the presentation, all of you who are on this presentation should know the current accepted definition of research or scientific misconduct, know the process by which allegations of research or scientific misconduct are lodged, investigated, adjudicated, and potential outcomes pursuant to findings of such. If you want to learn more, there are a lot of resources out there. If you had to download one particular resource, I would highly recommend this very free online Introduction to the Responsible Conduct of Research, which was written by Nicholas Stanek, who's actually a sociology at Michigan State in East Lansing. It's a very, very good introduction to the overall concepts of responsible conduct in research. So, the good, bad, and the ugly. Misconduct in science appears to be on the increase in some disciplines, but its prevalence is unknown, and how best to deal with it is unclear. Well, that was the status of the field about 20 years ago. We have made some advancements, and I will be going through that. So just to give you a historical concept, in the 1970s and into the 1980s, there were highly publicized cases of alleged scientific misconduct, and this then heightened the public awareness that there was a problem in the scientific enterprise. Why is this important? Because federal grant funding for research comes from taxpayers' dollars. Then in the early 1980s, there were congressional hearings on fraud in biomedical research. Late in the 1980s into the 1990s, a federal infrastructure was developed. Definitions of research misconduct were agreed upon, and then policies were put in place under the Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Research Integrity, the Office of Science and Technology Protections, and the Office of Health Research Protections. And then as we turned the century to the 21st century, there were incidents that were highly publicized with human subjects that resulted in deaths of patients. And then over the next couple of decades, definitions were revised. There's been an emergence of broad-based educational initiatives, such as what we are engaging in tonight. So in the early days, there were two conflicting perceptions: the perceptions of the scientific community in general versus the public's perception. The scientific community's perception was articulated by Dan Koshland, who's a world-famous biochemist at the University of California, Berkeley. He was then the president of the National Academy of Sciences, and also at that time the editor-in-chief of Science, one of the most famous scientific magazines worldwide. And what Koshland said was this, and this is a quote: "Problems of scientific misconduct are rare and the product of psychopathic behavior originating in temporarily deranged minds." But the public's perception was actually quite different, and it was articulated by then Senator Al Gore, who then eventually became vice president of the United States under Bill Clinton. And at the time, he was the chairman of the congressional hearings on scientific misconduct. And Gore articulated this perception that was in direct conflict with that articulated by Dan Koshland. And he said, "One reason for the persistence of this type of problem is the reluctance of people high in the science field to take these matters very seriously." And so matters proceeded, and there was this formal interrogation of the scientific enterprise. And in 1989, first definition of scientific or research misconduct was put forward by the Office of Research Integrity, federal government, and it was falsification, fabrication, or plagiarism, or other practices that seriously deviate from those that are commonly accepted within the scientific community for proposing, conducting, or reporting research. Does not include honest error or honest differences in interpretation or judgments of data. So, FFP, falsification, fabrication, or plagiarism. We have to understand these terms, which we will define in a moment. So subsequently, the U.S. Commission on Research Integrity was convened, and they came out with a statement that said the following: "Research misconduct is significant misbehavior that improperly appropriates the intellectual property or contributions of others," that's plagiarism, "that intentionally impedes the progress of research, or that risks corrupting the scientific record or compromising the integrity of scientific processes and practices. Such behaviors are unethical and unacceptable in proposing, conducting, or reporting research, or in reviewing the proposals of research reports of others." So let's just parse this out. Proposing. You write a grant proposal. If you put falsified data, fabricated data, or the data that were plagiarized in your grant application, you have engaged in research misconduct. Also, in conducting research, if you do any of those actions during the conduct of, let's say, collecting original data, you are guilty of research misconduct. If you then go on to write manuscripts and even submitting the manuscript, whether or not it's ever published, if you engage in falsification, fabrication, or plagiarism, you have engaged in research misconduct. And importantly, if you are serving, for instance, on a study section, or you are reviewing a manuscript, or you serve on an editorial board, or you're serving as a peer reviewer, and you engage in falsification, fabrication, or plagiarism, or any manuscripts or grant proposals that you might be reviewing, you're now also engaging in research misconduct. So the current federal policy under the Office of Research Integrity has been distilled and simplified to just this. Research misconduct is defined as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting research results. And the statements about deviating from scientific norms was deleted. The reason why is because they could hardly get common agreement across fields what exactly are the scientific norms. So to make things very simple and very easily understandable, this is the current definition of research misconduct. So let's break this out with definitions. Fabrication is making up data or results and recording or reporting them. This is very important, recording them. So it's bad enough that you are fabricating data, but entering it into, let's say, your lab notebook or in a computer record that you're going to use, let's say, later on for writing up manuscripts and possibly submitting them for publication or a grant application. This is fabrication, and recording is part of the problem. Falsification is manipulating research materials, equipment, or processes, or changing or omitting or results such that the research is not accurately represented in the research record. And then plagiarism is the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. And we'll see examples of this in just a moment. So there's actually been formal studies of what is the frequency of research misconduct. And this is an older study from more than a decade ago. But in this publication that appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the authors did a detailed analysis. And what they found is that the United States leads the world in scientific fraud. This is still true even more than a decade later. China is number one in the world in plagiarism, and China is also number one in the world in duplicate publications. And we'll talk about those things a little bit in a little bit later. So here's a case from Harvard University. It's a very famous guy, Mark Hauser. He's a professor of psychology, studies cognitive function in primates. Turns out that the data and the conclusions of several publications in highly respected journals had been brought into serious question by reviewers. And it turned out Hauser was found to be responsible for 8 instances of misconduct in his lab, including falsification of data. And this was reported to his department chair, the dean of the School of Medicine, and they took action against him. And I believe he had his research grants withdrawn. And I think he may have also lost his faculty position. Here's another example. This was published in The Scientist, which is a freely available a magazine that covers all kinds of aspects of scientific activities worldwide. Here's a case from the University of Kentucky, a husband and wife team who were found to have engaged in image duplication and falsification of data in publications. There are two kinds of falsifications. There are acts of omission, where you consciously don't reveal all of the data because you think that they don't so-called fit with your preconceived notion of how the data should look. And then there are acts of commission, where you consciously alter or fabricate data, or you overinterpret the data, forcing agreement with your preconceived notion of how the results should look. Okay. So the ORI, which is under the Public Health Service, is located in the Office of Public Health and Science, or the OPHS, under the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So we'll then go on to the third aspect of research misconduct, which is plagiarism. So what is plagiarism? The Office of Research Integrity considers plagiarism to include the theft or misappropriation of intellectual property and the substantial and unattributed textual copying of another's work. Does not include authorship or credit disputes. The key word here is unattributed. You can use somebody else's words in let's say, a publication, a grant application, as long as you give credit where credit is due. That is, put the direct quotes or even paraphrased text in quotations and give the source. Where did you get this from? Also, it is defined as theft or misappropriation of intellectual property, which includes unauthorized use of ideas or unique methods obtained by a privileged communication, such as a grant application or a manuscript that you happen to be reviewing. Plagiarism is very prevalent in China, and there was a study done several years ago. Here they report a number of high-profile plagiarism cases among professors have roiled the academic world in China, shedding new light on a practice that has been quietly plaguing the country's university system. I serve as the editor-in-chief of one of the major journals in the eye and vision research field called Experimental Eye Research. And every day I receive new manuscripts. Today I received 22. And every manuscript that comes through the editorial management system is subjected to scrutiny through a computer program called Authenticate. And every day I get a manuscript that has questionable plagiarism. And I have to then address this issue with the authors and see if I can get them to change the wording and be a little bit more straightforward. This is an example of an Authenticate report, and you can see the score on the upper right-hand side. 72% of the text in this manuscript was found to be identical or very similar to previously published literature that's in the world's data banks. Now, you can't accept this score directly because in the recent years there have been the advent of preprint servers. This allows people to get precedent in getting credit for a discovery. But these preprint servers are not peer-reviewed. So authors can simply upload their manuscripts to this one of these servers. And then when somebody submits a manuscript, it could be even identical to this manuscript. Let's say the authors want to go to a peer-reviewed format like a journal. Then the Authenticate will detect that work had been at least deposited on these preprint servers. That is not plagiarism if it's by the authors who generated the preprint in the first place. But if it is done by somebody who is not an author of that preprint server piece, that is plagiarism. Okay. But not every manuscript that goes through the Authenticate, or even every one that's from China, and here's an example, is guilty of plagiarism. So here you can see the scores is 8%, and you can hardly there. I have never seen a case that was even this low in real life in any manuscripts that I have reviewed. It's just almost unavoidable to have some kind of common language, especially in methods that are commonly used across the field. So it turns out that research misconduct is worldwide. It's a big problem in every country that engages in scientific research. But it's not only in the scientific or biomedical literature. So here's an example of a very famous guy who's a very astute, brilliant reporter for Reed Zakaria, and he was found to be guilty of plagiarizing somebody else's work in one of his news articles, and he actually agreed to apologize and to correct the problem. So there is something called self-plagiarism, and a lot of people have never even heard of this. But because of copyright laws, you can't copy substantial portions of text for one of your own prior publications, or any figures, illustrations, not just text, and then use it in a subsequent publication without placing the text or quotes and citing the original source. Also, you typically have to get permission for reusing text or any other materials from previously published work. Similarly, you cannot use the same figures, illustrations, tables in one or more publications unless you get prior permission from the copyright holder, which typically is the publisher, not you, and give credit duly to the original source. So, for instance, this is very common practice in review articles. You want to illustrate some important concept in a review. You want to replicate a figure, some data, or even text. You can do so if you cite the source. Okay, so how do you avoid engaging in plagiarism? You should take clear, accurate notes about where you found specific ideas. You should write down a complete citation and information for each item that you use. Use quotation marks when you're directly stating another person's words, and always credit the original authors for their information and their ideas. This illustration that's on the lower right-hand side of my slide, I was not the author of that, and I give the citation of where I got that from. Okay. So I told you this is an international problem, and here's an article from Nature, another major scientific journal, that says that this is a big problem, and if in this paper that was published in the British Medical Journal, this study found that 13% of doctors and medical academics had firsthand knowledge of inappropriately adjusting, excluding, altering, or fabricating data, but only 6% said that they were aware of cases of possible research misconduct at their institutions that they thought had been properly investigated. So this is a problem. You can sort of get under the radar screen, at least for a while, if you engage in this misconduct, but eventually the truth will be out. Okay. Here's another thing. Because science is increasingly collaborative, the term of team science is certainly be familiar to everybody. And here at the University of Buffalo, in the tenure and promotions process, team science has actually become increasingly valued. So this is something that you need to be aware of. And here's a quote from an article that came out several years ago. Few people can distinguish between the smell of day-old fish and the odor of the paper in which it was wrapped. That's just how it is with scientific misconduct. The misconduct of those working with you may become yours. In the worst case, your lab is shut for investigation, your publications are retracted, Your name becomes suspect even if you reported the suspected misconduct and the investigation is fair. The accuser and the accused may become intertwined as the investigation proceeds, and all too often the reporter and the reported blame each other, making the investigation protracted and contentious until the allegation is sustained or not. So even though you didn't personally engage in the misconduct, if somebody in your team did, and you publish that work or present it in the public domain, or even have falsified or fabricated, plagiarized data in your research notebooks, you are part of the overall research misconduct. So why does this matter? Well, as I mentioned early on, that there was a congressional hearing that was held more than 2 decades ago, because the public was, there was a public outcry over the reports that they were reading in papers like the Washington Post and the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle. And so this undermines the public trust in medical research and health workers. It also, very importantly, corrupts the scientific record, leads to false conclusions, and it leads to significant waste of resources, money, time, and effort chasing down these false leads. So I'm going to go into my rogues gallery of several high-profile cases of research misconduct, and you'll note that these all have occurred at very high-ranking academic institutions. So this is, I call the Sloan Kettering affair. There was a researcher named William Summerlin, 1974. He had claimed to have transplanted human corneas into rabbits. He had fake transplantation experiments in white mice by blackening patches of their skin with a Sharpie pen, essentially. His misconduct was basically overlooked, and eventually they attributed it to mental health problem. Recall that quotation from Daniel Koshland, the editor-in-chief at the time of Science magazine. And this was a form of scientific denial. This was such a famous case that Joseph Hickson actually wrote a book about this called The Patchwork Mouse that details in excruciating detail the entire, how this all happened, how this was initially overlooked and then was brought to light. Vijay Soman, Yale University, 1980. He was a diabetes expert at Yale School of Medicine. He authored 12 papers where the data were either missing or fraudulent. All of those papers eventually were retracted. A paper that he co-authored with Philip Fliesler, who was a senior researcher, professor of medicine at Yale, was stolen from another author when Fliesler was sent a paper to review, and Fliesler passed it along to Dr. Soman to review it for him. Fliesler, who was a tenured faculty member, had to resign. And this is an example of senior figures putting their names on papers that eventually turn out to be fraudulent, so-called gift authorship. And I'll talk about this more in my second lecture in a couple of weeks. John Darcy, cardiologist at Harvard Medical School. People realized that he was falsifying data. His supervisor was the head of cardiology at Harvard Medicine, Eugene Braunwald. He decided that this misconduct was an isolated incident, so he didn't get rid of him. But a few months later, it became clear that results had obtained in a multi-center study were very different from those obtained by others. An investigation showed that many of his more than 100 published studies were fraudulent. Many of the studies included so-called distinguished co-authors. Again, some of those people included on the author byline as co-authors contributed little or nothing to the actual work. Another example of honorary or gift authorship. Bob Sluxy, who's a cardiologist at UC San Diego School of Medicine. He published 137 papers between 1978 and 1985, sometimes one every 10 days. I don't know how long it takes most of you on this call to write a manuscript and submit it. It takes me several months to do it. Certainly can't do it in 10 days. A reviewer raised troubling questions about some of Slutsky's work, which is an illustration of how the peer review system sometimes is working and can detect fraud or research misconduct more broadly. An investigation concluded that 12 of Slutsky's studies were definitely fraudulent and 49 others were highly questionable. Many of these papers were retracted, but some of the journals declined to retract the studies. This simply doesn't happen anymore. And here's a case that I have a personal firsthand knowledge of. At the time, this was a very famous vision scientist, David Bridges, at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. That's where I did my postdoctoral research, and his lab was right down the hall from mine. He was sent a manuscript from Dr. John Dowling, who was a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a professor of biology and biological sciences at Harvard University. And he was sent this paper to review from a competing laboratory, Robert Rando at Harvard. But then, oddly, Dr. Bridges declined to review this manuscript, and he claimed that there was a conflict because he said he was doing very similar work in his laboratory. Meanwhile, he took the methods section from Rando's manuscript, gave it to his technician, who then he reproduced the experiments exactly as Dr. Rando had reported in his manuscript. And then Dr. Bridges wrote up his own manuscript and submitted it to Science. Rando turned out to be one of the reviewers that was sent David Bridges' paper that was under review at Science. And so Dr. Rando reached out to Dr. Dowling, raised an issue of suspected plagiarism, and NIH impaneled an investigative team. And I'll talk more about this case in my second lecture. The panel basically concluded that this researcher, David Bridges, took data from a paper he peer-reviewed and used it for his own work. The accused, Dr. Bridges, says it just isn't true, but the NIH recommends debarment. So David Bridges, while this inquiry was ongoing, was in negotiation with Purdue University for a faculty position, and he moved to Purdue. Purdue didn't know anything about the ongoing investigation. They thought they were getting a world-famous and well-funded researcher, and basically the ceiling caved in when it was discovered that he had engaged in research misconduct. He lost all of his NIH funding. He was blocked for 10 years from receiving any federal grant funds. He was also debarred for life from serving on NIH study section panels or editorial boards. At the time, he was the editor-in-chief of the journal Vision Research, and he was debarred from reviewing manuscripts submitted for publication to any journal. And David Bridges was, I think, around 58 when this case came up. So being debarred from funding for 10 years essentially ended his scientific career. There's another high-profile case. Dr. Hwang Woo-suk in Korea published two very high-profile papers in Science claiming that he had cloned human embryos. Turns out that the data were falsified and fabricated, and they had to retract these publications. And this is another example of team science where there were multiple laboratories not only in Korea, South Korea, but also in the United States that were involved. And all of them had to go through a research misconduct inquiry. He ended up losing his position and basically was drummed out of science. These falsified papers were then retracted, and the editor-in-chief of science at the time was Donald Kennedy, who was at the time also the president of Stanford University, published these retractions. Okay. All scientific journals now have software platforms that can not only detect text that is plagiarized, but also they can detect that there are things going on that are unacceptable in image manipulation, such as electron micrographs or photomicrographs or even bar graphs. And in a study that was done in 2002, this Journal of Cell Biology, scrutinized the papers that were received in recent years, and they found that 25% of all accepted manuscripts had one or more illustrations that were manipulated in ways that violate the journal's guidelines. But Ira Mehlman, who's the editor at Yale, said that most of the cases were resolved when the authors provided revised figures, but in 1% of the cases, they found authors had engaged in outright fraud. This turns out to be a common problem, but fortunately, the journals have ways of detecting this image manipulation. Here's another example. Linda Buck received the Nobel Prize in 2004 in physiology or medicine. She had to retract scientific papers after scientists could not reproduce their original findings. And this is a repetitive motif, even as high up as people who have received the Nobel Prize. This is just another follow-up report on that particular instance. Here's another case, also from Harvard. Harvard professor admits fraud. A former assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and the Brigham said that he falsified and fabricated data in a study on sleep apnea. Again, this freely available magazine, The Scientist, reports these cases on a regular basis. Here's an example from a study that was published in Nature. A professor at the University of Minnesota that was engaged in Alzheimer's research. Turns out that there was evidence of falsification and fabrication of data in their publications. Okay, so here's a paper from an author who worked at the Mayo Clinic about almost a decade and a half ago, but he was fired for research misconduct. But he actually wrote this opinion piece on how to prevent fraud. And here's a quote from this paper, also published in The Scientist. Misconduct in science is increasing at an alarming rate and is an issue that needs to be addressed. The constantly evolving technology, the arrival of online-only journals, and other significant scientific developments warrant a reconsideration of the existing procedures in place to prevent fraud and the development of novel verification techniques. And certainly in the ensuing years, the advent of artificial intelligence, generative AI, has become the bane of the publishing world because it's very, very difficult whether or not somebody actually generated these data originally or they were fabricated through one of these platforms such as ChatGPT. So there was a study performed on the frequency of misconduct, and this is from an old study that was published in the British Medical Journal. And I took this slide from the editor of the journal at that time. That study found that a redundant or duplicate publication occurs in approximately 1/5 of published papers, 20%. Also, 1/5 of people listed as authors of studies in medical journals contributed little or nothing to those studies, so-called gift or honorary authorship. Most authors of studies in medical journals have conflicts of interest, yet they are declared in less than 5% of the cases. These numbers have been drastically reduced in the past decade or more, thankfully. So why does scientific fraud happen? Well, why wouldn't it? It happens in all other activities. There's also this thing called publish or perish. There's a tremendous pressure to publish your research. This is your credentials, basically, for obtaining grant funding for engaging in research. Part of the problem also has been thought to be inadequate training. Courses and workshops like the one that we are doing right here is hoping to kind of reduce the frequency of scientific misconduct. And then, of course, because you can get away with it, at least for a while, because the system is built upon trust. People think, okay, I read it in Nature, I read it in Science, I read it in Cell, it must be true. And it turns out that that's not necessarily the case. So what are the consequences of fraud in clinical trials? If fraud takes place in a clinical trial, it places all human subjects in the trial at possible safety risk. Fraud jeopardizes the reliability of submitted and/or published data and undermines the Public Health Service's mission to protect and promote the public health. A finding of research misconduct requires three things: that there had been significant departure from accepted practices of the relevant research community, that the misconduct is committed intentionally or knowingly or recklessly, and the allegation is proven by a preponderance of the evidence. And we'll talk more about this in a moment. So, dealing with research misconduct, processes and protections, they must be fair and impartial. Also, protection of the informant, the person who brings the allegation of research misconduct, that you call the whistleblower, and then protection of the accused, also known as the subject. Then there must be objectivity and expertise. So the people who are impaneled to review the allegations of misconduct must be objective, and they must have a suitable expertise to be able to critically assess the allegation. It has to be done in a timely manner and also with utmost confidentiality. We have here at the university a process in place, and there are ways to deal with allegations of misconduct in a formal way. I have actually served on such a panel several years ago. There are three phases of the response to the allegation of misconduct. First, there's an inquiry phase, the assessment of whether or not the allegation has substance and if an investigation is warranted. If it's thought that an investigation is warranted, there's a formal development of a factual record. There's examination of that record leading to dismissal of the case or to recommendation for finding of research misconduct or other appropriate remedies. Those recommendations are made to the provost. And third, the adjudication, during which recommendations are reviewed and appropriate corrective actions are determined. This is all in place under the Research Office of Research Integrity. So if you are aware of what you think is research misconduct, you need to recognize it and report it. And you report it to your dean or the Office of Research Integrity or Academic Integrity or the provost of the university, and they will then engage in a process that I've just described in the previous slide. Okay, This is very important. Protection of whistleblowers. Safeguards for informants give individuals the confidence that they can bring allegations of research misconduct made in good faith to the attention of appropriate authorities or serve as informants to an inquiry or investigation without suffering retribution. Safeguards include protection against retaliation for informants who make good faith allegations, fair and objective procedures for the examination and resolution of allegations of research misconduct, and diligence in protecting the positions and reputations of those persons who make allegations of research misconduct in good faith. You notice that the statement in good faith is reported because there have been cases where people have tried to destroy somebody's research career because they have some kind of personal vendetta. And so they fabricate an allegation that is not in good faith. And the person who fabricates allegations will be subject to other actions, which could also include termination of employment. The United States legal system is based on the British legal system and the fundamental clause of innocent until proven guilty. So there are safeguards for subjects of allegations, the people that are accused. Safeguards for subjects give individuals the confidence that their rights are protected and that the mere filing of an allegation of research misconduct against them will not bring their research to a halt or be the basis of other disciplinary or adverse actions absent of compelling reasons. Other safeguards include timely written notification of subjects regarding substantive allegations made against them, a description of all such allegations, reasonable access to the data and other evidence supporting the allegations, and the opportunity to respond to allegations, the supporting evidence, and the proposed findings of research misconduct, if any. This system is in place here at this university. So what are the consequences? Well, it depends on several things. Depends on whether or not misconduct was done knowingly, intentionally, or recklessly, or whether or not it was an isolated case, or whether it's a part of a pattern of misconduct. And three, whether or not there was significant impact on the research record, research subjects, other researchers, institutions, or the public welfare. So what are the potential consequences? Well, if it's a publication, your publication more than likely will be retracted. As occurred to Dr. Bridges, you could get debarment, which is loss of grant funding, both your current funding, and you could have a extended period, possibly for life, debarment of loss of grant funding, removal from editorial boards, grant review panels, and the like. And also, you could lose your job. You could be terminated from your employment. And almost all of these cases do come to light, and they are published in the public domain, such as in the journal The Scientist, but also in the lay press, such as newspapers and the like. So this will lead to public humiliation. Also, it can make it into the news media, on radio and television. So life after fraud, okay? Every year, the Office of Research Integrity penalizes a handful of biomedical scientists for misconduct, typically barring them from funding for a few years. In theory, once the penalty period is up, the punishment and the shame should be over. However, in the age of the internet, announcements of debarments that ended years ago are easily retrievable with an online search of the scientist's name. So debarment is the gift that keeps on giving. Your reputation is basically toast if you engage in this kind of behavior. So in conclusion, just do the right thing. You know the difference between good and evil, moral reason, remember, right and wrong. Just do the right thing, yeah? Okay, and here's a very simple, concise primer of how to avoid ethical violations. This was published in the Journal of Biological Chemistry, which is a publication of the American Society of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. And by the way, all of the slides for my lectures and hopefully for all of the other lecturers will be made fully available to you and freely available, probably in a PDF format. So you don't have to take copious notes when you are taking these lectures and course. Again, there's lots of references out there. Again, this Introduction to Responsible Conduct of Research is a really good one. It's free. I highly recommend that you download this. All right. So are there any questions in the chat yet?
We have no questions in the chat yet at this time, but maybe people will have them along the way.
Okay, great. All right. So there are going to be 3 cases for discussion. These are going to illustrate the fundamental principles of research misconduct that I highlighted today. And I came up with these cases myself. Okay, so I'll just read the case. John is trying to get his lab work done in a hurry because he's scheduled to fly home for the next day for summer vacation. However, the results of his most recent experiments are not coming out the way he had predicted, i.e., the experiments didn't work right. Okay, so several of the data points fall far from the best fit line for their dose response, and the statistical analysis, the ANOVA of the data, indicates a lack of significance between the treated versus the control sets. So John decides to remove the data points that don't seem to fit well with the others. By doing this, the remaining data conform to his preconceived notion of how the results should look. The graph of the data is linear and a correlation coefficient nearly equal to 1, and the ANOVA indicates high statistical significance. John is pleased with this outcome and goes home for vacation, thinking everything is just fine. Okay, so here are the questions. And I'm going to be calling on people at random. And so hopefully you have your mic on when I call on you to answer these questions. Dr. Singh, Mahip Singh, can you unmute yourself, please?
Hi, yes.
Okay, so is John guilty of scientific misconduct? Why or why not?
Yes, John is guilty of scientific misconduct because omission of data is as much of a problem as is commission of data, and that's what he has done.
Is exactly the correct answer, and I hope everybody also agrees with that. Okay, Danielle, is it Dauphin?
That's the French way of pronouncing it, but I usually pronounce it Dauphin.
Okay, Dr. Dauphin.
I'm not a doctor. I'm actually a research coordinator, but thank you.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So would your answer be different if John simply kept these results in his lab notebook or on his computer, but didn't ever publish them or present them in a public forum? Why or why not?
Based on what you presented, I think it would still be considered misconduct because one of your slides did mention whether or not it's accepted for publication, it would still be considered misconduct. It's a slippery slope though, because if it's just in a private notebook, will somebody really see it? But you never really know.
Right, but because of the ORI definition, it's about recording results.
Exactly.
Okay, as well as presenting those results, publishing them, or putting in a public domain, such as even an abstract at a meeting or a platform presentation at another university, for instance. Anything that time you put it into the public domain and it's false, it is misconduct. So hopefully people understand that. Let's find somebody else. Maybe Liz, you want to pick out a participant from your list?
First I'll ask, is anyone willing to volunteer?
Is it Juliana?
Yes, I'm an undergraduate student, so not a
Oh,
doctor.
okay, thank you.
Um,
So
I'll
I'm
do,
going to ask you, would your answer be different if John submitted the results in a grant application, but it wasn't funded? Why or why not?
um, well, it would still be falsification. Wait, can you repeat the question again? I'm sorry.
So we've already determined that John has engaged in research misconduct, but
Mhm.
would your answer be different if John submitted the results in a grant application, but the grant application wasn't funded? Why or why not?
No, I would still keep the same answer. It is
Well,
still like misleading data.
right, because the Office of Research Integrity's definition of research misconduct would include any form of entry of falsified, fabricated, or plagiarized data, such as in a manuscript or a grant application. So yes. And finally, let's have another participant. You want to pick somebody out?
We have a hand raised, Carl Williams.
Carl, thank you for stepping forward. Uh,
Sure.
so, Carl, what should John have done instead?
He should have acknowledged the data the way it came out. It has meaning as it exists. And why did the data points not fit? Was the experiment done correctly in the first place? Is there something about the data that we can learn? So be honest and acknowledge the data. Try and figure it out.
I think that's a very good, well-reasoned answer. Um, you know, from sample to sample, things can happen in a laboratory, and you can't always have exact replication from sample to sample. So that's why you get variation in the first place. Okay. Plus, there's fundamental biological variation from person to person, sample to sample. So you just have to acknowledge that there is going to be this variability. So a lot of times when you see that standard error or standard deviation is somewhat broad, what is one way that you could deal with that to see if maybe you get an improvement in your experimental results? Anybody, can you chime in?
Hi, I'm Sapta. I'm one of the neonatologists. Can we just increase the sample size to have like more, um, like better clarification whether it's a positive study or not?
That is exactly what I was looking for. So the N, the number of independent biological specimens or sample, by increasing that number, you probably get your statistics to be improved. So you'll note particularly in clinical studies, the recruitment could be hundreds to thousands of patients. In the Million Veterans program, there are more than 750,000 subjects who have biological specimens that are in the database. So you can get a huge N for any study that you're trying to conduct with those data. So very good. All right, so I think we've beaten this one to death. Let's go on to case number 2. And by the way, any of these names, I just picked them at random. I'm not picking on any person really named John or Janie, okay? So in this case, Janie has been trying to get her experiments to work, i.e. according to her preconceived notion of how the data should appear, but they just aren't panning out, kind of like with John. She's under a lot of pressure from her PhD advisor to get new results for a grant application he's planning to submit in a few weeks. So Janie decides to construct a graph of data that she didn't actually collect, but that would seem to conform with the known literature and also her concept of how the experiment should work. She gives the graph to her advisor, who says, "Wow, These are great results. They're just what I needed for my NIH grant application. Good work. Janie leaves the lab, happy that her advisor is so pleased with her work. However, several hours later, as she's trying to go to sleep, she has second thoughts about what she's done. So the question comes up, did Janie commit scientific misconduct? Why or why not? Or if so, under what part of the ORI's definition of scientific misconduct does this fall?
We have a hand raised. Go ahead and unmute.
Is it Glenda? Who wants to speak up?
Okay, sorry, my computer is having a moment. Yes, I believe that she committed scientific misconduct under fabrication because she created data that actually wasn't the data that she'd done the experiments from.
That is exactly the correct answer, and I hope everybody also understands that.
We have another hand raised.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have a different view.
Okay.
And it's because I come from a background of modeling of pharmacometrics. Janie's scientific misconduct occurred because she presented model-based or literature-based predictions as if they were collected data. But if she had presented it as a priori predictions to her supervisor, and her supervisor had clearly indicated these are model-based predictions in the application, no misconduct would have taken place.
But those are not the particulars of the case that were presented.
I understand, and I'm making an important point here that there's nothing wrong with modeling and simulation, and people should not think that there is, but it's how it's framed and how it's presented that matters.
If that is what the objective of the research was, then if you're simply presenting prediction, that is fine, as you state. But the particulars of this case is Janie was given a task to perform experiments, collect original data, and to graph those data. And she didn't have the data. She was lazy. She didn't even do the experiment. She simply free-handed the data. That is the particular that is being discussed in this particular case. And so the answer that was given previously is, in fact, the correct one. Okay? If her advisor decided not to include the graph in his grant application, would this change your answer? Did Janie commit scientific misconduct? Let's hear from, is it Jordan?
Yes.
Jordan, so tell us your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think it still is misconduct, even if her advisor didn't include the graph in the grant application, because, as we said before, she just fabricated it and intended to submit it anyways as if it were actual data that she collected, which she didn't. So it doesn't matter if it was submitted or not. It's still just made up on the spot and treated as authentic data, which it wasn't.
So that is also very correct. She has engaged in fabrication, but also compounded it because it's part of the scientific record of the laboratory. Okay, so a person who, let's say, came into the laboratory 2 years later and looked through these records might think that those are authentic data and then base their own work on the false premise that those are real data. So the research record is false, and therefore she is engaged in research misconduct. So very good. Okay, let's take it up a notch. If her advisor did include her graph in his grant application, is he guilty of scientific misconduct? Let's hear from, is it Samantha?
Hello, yes, it's Samantha. So I think the advisor would not be guilty of scientific misconduct because he wasn't aware that the results that Janie gave him or her was fabricated. so he would not be guilty of that.
Interesting
I
answer.
have
Go ahead.
a different thought. I think her supervisor is guilty of scientific misconduct because her supervisor needed to verify that the student really did the work, see the original lab result, lab data, lab record, rather than just believe her final graph, showing to her. So the supervisor has a responsibility to make sure the data is true data. So she is involuntarily involved in this, but so she got a responsibility to verify, to check, rather than just believe whatever she said. The student tell the supervisor. So I think the supervisor is guilty.
Let's hear other people who want to weigh in on this. How do others feel about this? Is it Emmanuel?
I would say that this is correct. The supervisor always has the responsibility to ask the question, otherwise they're guilty of negligence. They did not exercise diligence. They were not properly responsible.
Very interesting response. Is it Noah? Yamaguchi, you have your hand up?
Yes, hi. You were talking earlier about how the people in your group, if someone performs scientific misconduct, they also can be guilty by association. And so I think that's the case here, where the investigator would also be guilty despite not fabricating the data themselves.
That's also a very interesting take. So I purposely constructed this case. Just a moment, and I'll recognize you. Is it Gauri?
Yeah, sorry for interrupting you.
It's okay. I will give you your chance to speak, but I want to explain to the group that I purposely made this a bothersome case, okay? That it's not cut and dry. Because I think what we can just talk about, whether or not the advisor could be brought up on allegations at his institution of misconduct, but whether he actually would be found guilty might be problematic. And I'll talk about it in just a moment, but I want to give Gauri an opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Dr. Fliesler. I have a different opinion about this question, and I wanted to say that I think every PI expects their students to have ethical responsibility. And having said that, I think this question would require the authorities to do a proper investigation before we can simply say yes or no.
Okay. So basically, you got to the crux of this because everybody, I think, recognized that Janie engaged in research misconduct. What I was trying to make you uncomfortable with is whether or not her advisor was guilty of research misconduct. And at least 2 to 3 other people brought up a very valid point that it is incumbent of the advisors, the PIs of the laboratory, the people who are supervisors of graduate and postgraduate training, to trust but verify, okay? Trust but verify. Yes, the expectation is that your students are ethical people and doing what they should do, but you really need to go back to the original data and scrutinize it in your lab group meetings to ensure things were done correctly, where the data came from, whether or not they are believable, okay? So that is an onus on the advisor, absolutely. But
We do have a question in the chat.
Go ahead.
It says, in this case, to what extent is an advisor ethically responsible for verifying the authenticity of data? Or in a real research case, do researchers rely on trust?
So I would say that it varies from one lab to another, but let's say the most appropriate behavior is, yes, you believe that the student is presenting the data that they actually collected, but you have to go to the original data. In other words, don't just look at a PowerPoint presentation of data as if it's real. And I can tell you, because I have been personally stung by this. I had a master's student about 5 years ago who presented in a lab group meeting every week, showed bar graphs, showed statistical analysis. Everything looked really good until we found out that the original data, which were on the instruments that the measurements were taken on, the original data actually didn't graph out the way he had shown. And so we had to adjudicate this particular case. It was extremely embarrassing for me as well as the student. So advisors must trust but verify. Okay. Now, let's talk about whether or not the advisor would have been found guilty. Remember, I said that it depended on whether or not it was done knowingly or capriciously or recklessly. In this case, the advisor trusted the student, trusted that the data were real, but he didn't verify. Okay, so he didn't know that the data were not real. And I think that if this had been investigated and brought to a panel, this would come out in the investigation process. And likely he would be found not guilty of engaging in misconduct himself, but he would be reprimanded about his obligations and responsibilities of trusting but verifying. So this case should sit with you with some uncomfort, okay? That's why I made the wording exactly the way it is, so that we would have this kind of discussion. And so I want to thank everybody. Emmanuel, you have a hand up, so I'm happy to hear your points.
Yeah, I have a much harsher point, and I'm sorry I have a much less positive view of it than you do. And it concerns simpler situations that are quite prevalent. That is, researchers using AI to author scientific papers and legal briefs. And quite a number of academics have been fired from very senior positions, or lawyers lose their license to practice because the references or cases that they cited or the analysis they performed is incorrect, and or the references don't exist, and the result of AI hallucinations. This is a very likely possibility and a real warning, because it's happened quite a lot.
I thank you very much for that additional commentary. And I think it's something that, increasingly this has become a significant problem. And I'm going to actually talk about the generative AI, and its impact on publishing in my next lecture. But yeah, it's food for thought. And this particular case, I think everybody recognized that Janie, the student, the trainee, was definitely guilty of research misconduct. Where it gets a little more fuzzy is what about the advisor and what he did with the data. So thank you very much for this discussion. And we're going to move on to the last case for tonight, and we'll be on time. So here is case number 3. Akbar is a new postdoctoral research fellow, and he's writing a review article with his mentor, Dr. I.B. Studley, who's a senior, well-established researcher with considerable gravitas in his field. However, he's experiencing difficulties with writing, primarily because English is not his primary language. In the course of reading articles that are pertinent to his review, he finds several passages of text to say exactly what he wants to say in his review. So he uses the cut and paste feature of his computer program to excise multiple passages from multiple articles in the literature and insert them verbatim into his review article. Akbar submits his manuscript to Dr. Studley. At first, Dr. Studley is quite impressed with what Akbar has written and commends him on doing a fine job. However, later it occurs to him that the text just doesn't sound the way Akbar normally speaks or writes. Also, he has an increasing sense of deja vu, i.e. that he's read those same words somewhere before. Okay, so here come the case questions. So did Akbar commit scientific misconduct? Why and why not? And if so, under what part of the aura definition of scientific misconduct does this fall? Let's see a volunteer, please. Somebody that hasn't spoken yet. There's a whole bunch of people online, 71 people. Let's hear somebody else, please.
I can go.
Thank you. Is it Elizabeth?
My name is Onyecha.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. There's several people that lit up at the same time.
Oh, okay.
So, okay, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I was having trouble unmuting. Yes, he committed scientific misconduct. This would be plagiarism.
Cut and dry. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Elizabeth Griffiths, I will call on you for the next one.
Okay.
So, if
we want to reverse that.
Okay.
Onyeka can go next, and Elizabeth had just responded.
Okay, thank you. Looking at the hand still up. Okay. If Akbar had been more crafty and he had slightly changed the wording of the excised passages such that they were not verbatim, would this change your answer? Why or why not?
No, it's still plagiarism. The context and the idea being communicated is the same. Changing words doesn't remove from the fact that the ideas are essentially the same. So I would classify this still as plagiarism.
I think a good answer. It is. Does anybody else want to comment on this?
Hi, it's Danielle again. I actually helped my PI with a lot of publications, and with that, I agree that even if it's slightly changed, it's still considered plagiarism. And even if he just summarizes it, he really has to reference the original source next to that sentence, as well as in the references at the end. I was going to answer something for the next question about English not being the primary language, but I don't want to take away the opportunity for somebody else to answer.
Thank you. So I think your commentary is spot on. Somebody else had a hand up, and I would like, who was that?
Thank you. That was me. My name is Takutwa. And I was going to say almost the same as the last speaker, which was what they need to do is to reference the content of the text, regardless of how they've paraphrased it. They would need to attribute it to the original source. So as long as that's not done, then it is essentially still plagiarism. Thank you.
Very good. And would you like to take this follow-up? Is Akbar justified in his actions given that English is not his primary language? In other words, is it less egregious? Why or why not?
So I don't think so. I don't think it makes it any less of plagiarism just because he couldn't write English. There's many different ways of getting help with phrasing. There's language editors. So I think he may as well write in his primary language and then get a scientific language editor to help him with translation to English. That would be my take on it. Thank you.
Very, very interesting. And so English is a really difficult language, and it's hard to master. Even in people who were born and raised in the United States. Believe me, I've read so many PhD theses that need to be rewritten because the English grammar and word choice usage have been atrocious. So I understand that it is very difficult to write a high quality manuscript in the English language, but there are tools available, as we just heard. And by the way, the publishing houses, like for instance, Elsevier, which is the largest scientific and biomedical publisher in the world, with over 1,400 journals in their library of journals. They have professional English editing services in multiple countries, in multiple primary languages. So there are tools that are available to help people to write what they want to say, but without plagiarizing other people's ideas, words, processes. Okay. And then finally, what consequences might Akbar face for his actions? You know, at the end of my lecture, I talked about this. Let's hear from somebody.
We have one comment in the chat that says he could be removed from his position, and we also have a hand raised.
Great. So that answer is correct. It is a possible outcome. Elizabeth, you're raising your hand?
Yes, that definitely would be a possible outcome since he's not a faculty member, a postdoctoral fellow in training. They might decide to be less strict and give him some remedial education on this and give him a second chance. I think that might be appropriate.
So I think that's a very good answer. And I think in real life, for instance, if this had happened in my lab with a postdoc, I wouldn't fire the person. I would use it as a learning opportunity, a teaching opportunity, and to instruct the postdoc the correct way of dealing with this kind of situation. And I can say, remember, when I talked about consequences, remember I said whether or not it was an isolated incident or was this a chronic pattern of behavior. So from the particulars that we are given, it seems that this was a one-off. In other words, this is the only example that Akbar engaged in this behavior. So I would think that his advisor would be strict, but also more lenient and would instruct Akbar in what the correct behavior is and what the expectations are, not only of his own laboratory, of the scientific community as well. Emmanuel.
Yeah, I have a related question. It's not this particular case, but what about the situation, say, with a mature researcher who has written a lot and is inadvertently guilty of self-plagiarism, meaning maybe he's written a dozen articles in the field and he doesn't remember that what he wrote in the new paper that sounds like what he wrote in the old one.
Yeah, so again, that would go to knowingly or unknowingly, right? So what is the gravity of the situation is he didn't really purposely engage in self-plagiarism. But if it was detected, it could be pointed out that this would need to be corrected. So for instance, when I handle these cases of presumed plagiarism that are detected by this computer platform Authenticate, I always give the authors instruction of what the rules are, and then instruction on how they need to remedy the text so that they're not engaging in self-plagiarism. So this, before this ever goes to publication, this can all be edited. Yeah. Charles.
Yes, I was going to say befittingly, this would be a case to ensure that they take courses such as the one we are just having, responsible conduct of research. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. That gives me a certain validation. Thank you very much for the comment. We are at the end of the course time, and I appreciate everybody's participation and engagement. It's a much larger than normal group. So I will thank you for your attention, and I will see you on the 25th of February for the next lecture. Thank you, everybody.